Hello, this is me, Rita von Holstein.
Hello, this is Luca De Biase.
And welcome to Reimagine Talks, the podcast to challenge the way we think. And today we're here to challenge the concept of taxation with Professor Rita de la Feria.
Rita de la Feria is professor of tax law at the University of Leeds and an international research fellow at the Oxford University Centre for Business Taxation. Her work focus is primarily on tax law and policy, and she has published widely in these areas, including 5 books and over 60 journal articles and book chapters. Professor de la Feira has been tax policy and legal drafting advisor to the Portuguese government and has advised countless governments all around the world. She was listed 2 years running in the Global Tax 50 by the International Tax Review as one of the most influential tax people in the world. She was co-recipient of the 2016 Outstanding Women in Tax Award, awarded by the Tax Analyst, and was recognized in the 100 Years of Women in Tax as one of the most influential women in tax in the last 100 years by the International Fiscal Association.
Rita, welcome and thank you very much for joining us here today. Having been at the center of this debate and this conversation for such a long time, can you maybe give our listeners a bit of an explanation of what do we actually mean by taxation and why is reimagining taxation such an important issue?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think the first point to start is kind of with a broad definition of taxes. And taxes are, in essence, these compulsory payments that we do to government, which are then used for public services. And this definition kind of encompasses this idea of pooling, which is the same as when we get insurance, for example. We all contribute so that we can then benefit when we need it, so that the hospital is there when we need it, so that the schools are there when we need it, so that there is someone at the end of the phone when we report a crime. So in essence, we all contribute so that we can avail of this public service. So everything that is around us is a result of taxation. The hospitals, the roads, the water supplies, when we turn on the tap, when we send our kids to school, all of those things are paid by taxation, not public transport. So tax is really kind of essential to everything we do as individuals. It's at the foundation of what our societies are about. I sometimes get a little bit frustrated because people often think about taxes as, Excel spreadsheets or the pain that you have to endure at the end of the year, that you have to fill your tax return, etc. Whilst in reality, is it a fascinating concept that we have all agreed somehow, we, human species, have agreed somehow to get together and all contribute so that we can all live better and be there for those moments when somehow you cannot do it yourself, or that it's better if we all contribute so that it can be available to everyone else. So it is actually a fascinating concept at the center of what we are as societies. It's not boring. It's not about it. It's not about Excel spreadsheets. It's not about numbers. It's about the concept of who we are and what we want to be.
The current tax system, based on geography and source of income, was designed for an industrial economy with national borders, which is rapidly being replaced by a global, digital, and highly mobile economy. The latest tax to be invented was the VAT in the 50s. How much do you think that current calls for a fairer economy is based on our taxation system not being designed for the times we live in?
So I'll first start by challenging a little bit what you just said, Lucas. So we actually have invented many new taxes in the last 50 or 60 years. They are just smaller taxes. So the huge growth that we have had in excise taxes. So for example, sugar taxes, fuel taxes, motor vehicles taxes, all of those taxes, that huge growth on what we would call regulatory taxes, taxes that exist to make us consume a little bit of products that are bad for our health or bad for the environment. Those are very new taxes. But it is true that the bulk of our taxation is still centered of kind of key three taxes: corporate income tax, personal income taxes, and VAT. So these are still the bulk of our tax systems worldwide in Europe, but not just in Europe. Those taxes were constructed for a different world. We have been relatively successful adapting VAT systems worldwide to the digital globalized economy. So there has been a huge effort, both at global level, led largely by the OECD, but also at European level. And on this area, this is an area where Europe has really been leading the way in adapting VAT system to a globalized and digitalized economy. So we have been largely successful on the adaptation of that tax. We have been less successful despite multiple attempts on corporate income tax. And we haven't attempted at all to adapt our personal income taxes. So I think that there's still a lot to do. It's another area, as I already said, that I was frustrated about sometimes how people think about taxes. This is another area that causes me some frustration. We have devoted a lot of political capital and financial resources to sorting out corporate income tax with arguably small benefits. I mean, there has been advances, but not huge advances compared to the amount of resources that we put in. On the contrary, we have put, at this moment in time, very, very limited resources to the big challenges of adapting our personal income tax systems to a digital globalized economy. And the truth is, in Europe, we are particularly susceptible to these risks because the majority of the world, VAT outside the kind of richer countries, VAT is the biggest tax, the most important tax, followed usually by corporate income tax. This is obviously not exact science, but this is a general rule of thumb. In Europe, the most important tax overall are personal income taxes, followed then by VAT. So the fact that we haven't started thinking about the consequences of a global and digital economy in the context of our most important taxes in Europe is of concern to me. And we have started seeing the mobility of labor kicking in, people moving across Europe, living in different countries, having a residence in one country and working in another member state. We have seen the beginnings of automation that at medium term can cause very significant challenges to the personal income tax system. And yet somehow all our resources are being, or almost our resources are being pocketed into corporate income tax, where it has been very hard to reach agreement.
Well, I love the fact that you mentioned that there's a lot to do, because this is really at the ethos of Reimagine Europe, and also why we're so happy to have you here, is to say, where do we go from here? So to really see the inspiration of what is possible. And I think you've set a big challenge in terms of where are the areas that we really need to focus to reimagine taxation. So thank you very much for that. There's another area that I also wanted to ask you about. In a recent article, you wrote also about taxation from a global perspective. We tend usually to think about taxation from a national perspective, very navel-gazing about how this works for us as a country. But there's also a whole international dimension. And the concept of fairness in that dimension might look quite different from how we think about things normally. Could you expand a little bit on that and explain to our listeners how taxation and fairness is seen from this perspective?
So yes, so there is a big challenge in terms of global fairness, and when we think about fairness, we tend to think about fairness at a national level within our own borders. But in a globalized economy, it is just impossible to think on those terms. And the starting point, I guess, with this issue, and the starting point for the paper I wrote that you just mentioned on that topic, is really the fact that there are massive inequalities around the world. So in Europe, we are fortunate enough to live in rich countries that have high levels of public services where we have a level of comfort. And I know many of our listeners might be thinking, oh, but in my country. The truth is, in Europe, generally, we are still privileged compared to what is the case in many countries around the world. So starting from that point of inequality, many countries try to attract investment for economic growth and to boost their own tax revenues. In order to do that, they use different tools. One of them is corporate income taxation. So offering tax breaks to companies of some kind to attract investment for their own countries. Now, this basically means, in essence, that you start competing with each other. And now we in Europe are guilty of this too. We have overall participated in this global tax competition game in which we're trying to attract investment to our own countries to boost our own economies. But this largely ignores the fact that even if we manage to win this competition, let's imagine, and attract all the investment to Europe, there will be effects of this competition, indirect effects into our own countries. So we can't expect people to have fantastic lives in developing countries if they have no tax revenues to sustain public services. So the fact that you are engaged in a competition and trying to win the competition, and at the detriment, of course, of other countries, will mean, in fact, that you are enhancing that, to some extent, that inequality. We have to understand those trade-offs. So there is a link between the fact that we see levels of influxes of migration and people dying on the Mediterranean trying to reach Europe, and the fact that these countries often do not have enough tax revenues to sustain themselves and to invest in public services. Now, of course, I understand, because I speak to policymakers on a frequent basis, I understand the demands from the national demands. Politicians are responsible for their own countries. They are accountable to their voters. So obviously there is a tendency to look at your own needs and the needs of your people, because those are the people you're responsible for and accountable to. But what I think is important to understand is this global dynamics. So there is a trade-off to be had. These trade-offs need to be understood and internalized. So I understand that sometimes the option will be that our interests come first. I get that. But from a technical perspective, what I would like people to understand is this trade-off, to acknowledge that trade-off, to acknowledge that there are consequences to engaging in this competition and wanting more for us at the detriment of others getting a share as well. And I think in Europe, we have often not been either conscious, or perhaps we are conscious, but not willing to highlight these trade-offs. And from a technical perspective, what I would like to see is more acknowledgement of those trade-offs.
Thank you very much, Professor. As you know, at Reimagine Europa, we focus a lot on understanding how the narratives shape our understanding and framing of an issue. Do you think that we have such myths around taxation, and are they leading us astray?
I think that question, Luca, can be divided into two separate ones. The first is about the way we talk about tax and the issue of narratives. And I think a separate one is whether it's about the myths. So let me try to kind of separate those two questions and try to answer them separately. So about the fairness is a little bit connected to what I mentioned to Erica in the beginning, which is we try to convey the tax as something that is boring, and we're not successful enough telling people that this is about their daily lives, that this is about all the public services that you get in exchange. I'll just perhaps tell a little story that conveys this idea. So I'm originally Portuguese. And towards the end of the COVID period, when travel restrictions were off. I was visiting Portugal, and I was visiting my hometown, which is a small town just outside Lisbon called Cascais. And I was driving through Cascais. I know it's a very nice area. I would recommend all our listeners to go to Cascais and visit. So I was driving through Cascais and I was commenting. I was in the car with my husband. My children were at the back. And I commented with my husband how during the COVID period, the municipality of Cascais had made public transportation free for everyone. Right? So buses were now free. And I was commenting on the impact that had from a progressive perspective on the lives of people of lower incomes that use buses on a regular basis. And then I said, and that at the same time, during the COVID period, a lot of assistance was put into people that were living on their own, that were elderly, couldn't access shopping, etc. And I was commenting this just between my husband and I, and my son, who at the time was 11 years old, sitting at the back, looking at the window, just said as a passing comment, "You really see where your taxes go." And I looked back at him and I just said, there it is. This is tax morale in action. Now, of course, my son is completely indoctrinated. So, because he lives in our house, right? So my husband is not a tax person. He's a criminology professor, but he hears it from me. So my son is very aware of these things, but he's conveying a sentiment that, in essence, this is how we should be talking about taxes. We should be talking about taxes as this contribution in order to get better public services. We want to have free buses? That's great. Then we need to pay taxes. We want to have good healthcare? Then we need to pay taxes. And this framing is a much healthier framing. People understand this framing much better than if you start talking about GDP. Or talking about economic distortions, which only a very small number of people know what that means. Right? So if you start saying, if we increase taxes, you can have a national GDP growth of blah, 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 that means nothing to people, right? So if you talk about, if you have this type of taxation, you eliminate some economic distortions. Zero. No one knows what you mean by eliminate economic distortions. So we need to change the narrative in a way that people actually can connect with, can understand what we mean. And what we mean is, if you pay this, we will be able to afford that. Now, it might be that on balance, you don't want free buses. You prefer to pay less taxes. And that's fine. What is important from a technical perspective is that you understand the link between the two, right? So you understand that if you want to have the free buses, you have to have taxes to pay for those free buses. And then you may opt and you may say, no, we prefer private initiative. We prefer people to be responsible for their own buses so that they pay when they ride the bus and they don't pay when they don't ride the bus. And that's fine as well. But what you can't expect from a technical perspective, and you often hear politicians endorse this biggest myth of all, I would say, is this idea that you can have it both ways, that you can pay less taxes at the same time as having this wonderful public services, and that is just not possible. Now, on the myths part of your question, Luca. What I would say is that there are a lot of myths that come, in essence, from normal psychological phenomenon. First of all, and then second of all, from the fact that not everyone can be a tax expert. Right? So some of the tax myths have to do with the fact that people just don't understand enough about taxes, and that's fine. I don't understand maybe enough about education policy or healthcare policy, so everyone has their own expertise. Others are to do with psychological phenomena, all right? And we have been normal ones, like confirmation bias, for example, right? Or cognitive dissonance. So you tell someone something about the tax system. And the person will say, oh, I don't think that that's true. And then you try to prove them and try to show them that that is true. And their instinct is immediately to discredit what you're saying, because there is a cognitive dissonance. They believe that all their lives, and now you're telling them that they were wrong. So this type of acknowledgement of the impact of psychological effects on taxation, I think, hasn't been acknowledged enough. So when tax policy experts talk about these issues, they tend to talk about what is better from an efficiency perspective, what is better from a fairness perspective. And they ignore completely this whole big issue, which is the political economy of it. Now, you can devise all this wonderful system that has a perfect balance between efficiency and fairness. If you can't sell it to the general public, there is no point on designing that system. It all comes from the fact that people will believe what you're saying, right? And in order to do that, we have to understand how people feel about taxes. Why do they feel like that about taxes? How do they understand taxes? And there's just so many of these psychological effects influencing the way people think about tax policy. I often mentioned one kind of key one that influences a lot of elements on the tax policy, which is the way we perceive our own wealth. So if you have surveys about people's perception of where they are on the income distribution, so are they wealthy or are they poor, the majority of people will say they're in the middle. And that goes regardless of whether they are at the bottom half or at the top 1%. All of them will say that they are more or less in the middle. So everyone somehow is middle class. And that has big implications on tax policy. So, for example, when you say we would like the richer to pay more taxes, people will say in abstract, they will say, oh, of course we do. But they are never the rich ones, because when you say, oh, but rich in our country means, for example, more than 80,000 euros a year, right? So, oh, no, but I earn 90 and I'm not rich, right? So our perception of wealth distorts massively our tax policy options, because our perception of wealth is relative. So we perceive our wealth compared to others. And we humans, and then again comes this issue of the cognitive biases and the heuristics that we use. We humans always compare ourselves with those that have more. So you put a group of humans in a room and, five of them will have lower income than you and one will have a higher income than you. And we'll be talking about this new car they bought. You remember the one that had the new car. And this is because that is the way humans think about things. You just compare yourself, but that in itself has nothing to do with tax, but has massive implications for the construction of the tax system. So there are many of these myths that can be deconstructed if we thought a little bit more about them. I think the biggest issue for me, from a technical perspective, is for people to understand the impact that these elements have on the construction of tax policy. That the optimal tax policy is not just about what is fairest or what is more efficient, but actually how people feel about the taxes. Can you sell that tax? Can you sell that tax reform? And that is dependent on the political economy dynamics of taxes. So for me, the biggest issue or the biggest issue of all is if we could actually tackle some of these myths if we started from this first point, which is acknowledging that these myths come often from a place of political economy as opposed to pure efficiency and fairness.
Well, you mentioned two things that I think are extremely interesting. The first one is obviously the importance of public support for any policy or any vision that is brought forward. And actually, last week we had a citizen dialogue in Barcelona, and one of the key things that came out from the debate was the need to reimagine taxation. So there is a strong, I think, push from citizens or realization from citizens that the existing taxation system is not fair, is what came out through that debate, and we need a fairer system. So maybe that is linked a little bit to the myth discussion. And the second thing that I also think is highly relevant, and that's the link to the emotional side, and that this is highly emotional. I think when it comes to taxation, I mean, people are willing to uproot their lives and move somewhere else because of taxations in many cases, or move a little bit from one area to the other, to here in Belgium, for instance, to move over to a different region or to a different jurisdiction where the taxation is different. So it has huge implications on everyday life, and there is clearly a sense that we need to come with something new. In your opinion, is it possible to develop a new system or to reimagine taxation into a model that is both seen as fairer and competitive?
Again, there is kind of various elements to the question you just asked, Karka. I guess I'm too fascinated by taxes, so I could talk about these issues for a long time. But let me first tackle one of the assumptions in your question, which is actually I'll tackle two, but let me start with the first, which is that we know what we mean when we say we want a fairer tax system. Because fairness is not monolithic. Fairness is a kind of umbrella concept. They include many types of fairness. So let's assume that, and this is philosophically controversial, but let's assume by fairness, we mean tackling inequality. There are various types of inequality. There is obviously income inequality, but you have gender inequality, you have racial inequality. So first of all, you have to decide what type of inequality do you want to tackle. So, for example, tackling gender inequality may actually increase income inequality, because if you introduce measures to tackle inequality from a gender perspective, the likelihood is that women in higher incomes will benefit more than women in lower incomes, because they have higher salaries, for example. So if you give tax credits, you might be benefiting them. So we have to first decide what is our hierarchy of fairness in a way. So what fairness, accept first of all that fairness is not a unique concept, a monolithic concept that has the various dimensions, and then accept that sometimes when you increase the fairness on one side, you may be actually decreasing fairness on another side, right? So these trade-offs. Second, the fairness, so the trade-offs within fairness, but then fairness itself can have different elements to it. So, for example, environmental taxation, right? And imposing taxes that have an environmental regulatory objective. All excise taxes are by nature regressive. We know this. It has a negative income on people on lower incomes. The truth is we do those taxes because we think there are other objectives in the system, including environmental protection, that are more important and in the medium to long term are more important for the sustainability of the country and obviously of the planet itself, right? But this is often not acknowledged. And sometimes we do contradictory things. So I'll mention an example of a measure that was approved in the last couple of years in many countries, in European countries, that kind of epitomizes this kind of trade-offs that I'm talking about. So when the cost of living crisis and the prices of fuel went up, many member states introduced lower excise taxes or lower VAT on energy products in order to protect those on lower incomes. Right? Now, the consumption of fuel has massive negative externalities. That would be the kind of the technical concept, but it has massive negative effects on the environment. We know this. Fossil fuels are not good for the environment, right? At the same time, at that moment in time, consuming more energy meant that we were importing more energy from Russia. So it had actually geopolitical negative impacts, right? And yet we did it because income inequality at that moment in time was more important. And that's fine. I have no problem with saying at this moment in time, income inequality is a bigger urgency. But what I have a problem with is actually acting as if there are no trade-offs. We have just given a tax credit for people to consume items that are negative for the environment and that have negative geopolitical effects, right? And somehow no country in Europe that introduced these breaks, and there were several countries, European countries that did it, mentioned this as a trade-off. No one talked about the negative environmental effects that this has, right? So we need to kind of always be conscious of these trade-offs within fairness, with fairness and other objectives. And whatever options we take, from a technical perspective, that's fine, as long as they are informed options, right? The second thing I would like to challenge a little bit from your question is the concept of competitiveness. Now, I understand that often competitiveness is used as a shorthand for what we would call technically an efficient tax system. So a tax system that maximizes the welfare of the population and has as little impact as possible on the decisions of operators, right? But the two are not identical. So let's be clear on what we mean by competition, because when we say competitiveness, in a competition situation, there is always a winner and there is always a loser, right? So when we say we want a competitive tax system, what we mean is we would like my country or my region, in this case could be the European Union, to win as opposed to the other countries, either the other European countries or the other countries around the globe. And it goes back to the conversation we were having a few minutes ago about this issue of global fairness. There are trade-offs as well. So if we win the competitiveness, imagine that we are successful in making the European tax system more competitive than others. That means other countries will lose. So then we can't complain if public healthcare, public education, etc., criminality in other countries is not so good, and because there's not enough revenues, and people feel the need to migrate to other countries that have good healthcare and good education and good security conditions, right? So all these things, we need to be clear what we mean. I would have preferred a discussion that said, we want a fair tax system, we want an efficient tax system. This would be kind of more clear objectives. And yes, there's trade-offs between the two, but at least it's more technically precise than talking about competitiveness, which it means, in essence, that there will always be a loser. And that has kind of dynamics. Now, on the fair versus equity, of course, if you ask me, is it possible to have a fairer tax system? Yes. If you ask me, is it possible to have a more efficient tax system? Yes. Is it possible to have a fairer and a more efficient tax system? I would say that's trickier, because often they are contradictory in themselves, right? So the fairest tax system of all is a tax system that takes into account your personal circumstances, that almost individual by individual basis, right? The most efficient tax system of all is one that treats everyone the same, that there is no distinctions on conditions. So every tax system that we build has to be a kind of a balancing act between these two principles. Now, personally, I think Europe has the conditions to build a fairer and still more efficient tax system. So I think there is scope to do a little bit of the two, but we also have to be conscious that we can't have absolute fairness, we can't have absolute efficiency, and anything that we do will always be a compromise between these two objectives.
Yeah, Professor, it's a trade-off word with complex interrelations. So my last question is just for a summary. You already said many things, but which would be the single most important thing that we need to do to reimagine taxation?
I think the single most important thing that we need to do, and this will be a really short answer, is that we need to have a more honest debate. we need to acknowledge trade-offs within fairness, with fairness and efficiency between the tax system and other parts, other policy objectives like the environment. So we need a more honest debate. I think at this moment in time, the problem for me is often that this debate is too caught up in absolutes. In tax policy, there is very things that are fantastic or awful. Okay, there is a few things that are awful, but not that many. The majority of things that we have in tax policy is, on balance, A is better than B. Considering what we want to achieve, A is better than B. And I think that type of honest debate is what I would like to see for Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for joining us here today to Reimagine Taxation. And I hope that we will see a more fruitful public debate about these issues in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.